Across Europe, Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi, remains one of the continent's most mythologized royals. But behind the portraits and the legends stood four children whose lives tell a more grounded story. One who died before she could speak, one who became a Bavarian matriarch, one who carried the weight of a failing empire, and one who finally received the mother's affection denied to the others. Their births shaped dynastic politics. Their upbringings exposed the fractures inside the Habsburg court, and their fates, from quiet longevity to premature tragedy, continued to shape European royal lines long after Elizabeth's own death in 1898. This video traces in clear chronological order what happened to each of Empress Elizabeth's children, from birth to legacy, completing each life story in full before moving on to the next. When Elizabeth of Bavaria married Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria in 1854, she entered one of Europe's most rigid and tradition-bound courts. The 18-year-old bride faced immediate pressure to produce heirs for the Habsburg dynasty, a responsibility made more complex by the formidable presence of her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. Sophie had wielded considerable influence over Franz Joseph's upbringing and fully expected to maintain that control over any imperial grandchildren. The imperial household operated under strict protocols that had governed Habsburg family life for centuries, with children traditionally raised by court-appointed staff rather than their parents. Elizabeth's romantic nature and independent spirit would clash repeatedly with these established customs, creating tensions that would profoundly shape her relationships with her children throughout their lives. Between 1855 and 1868, Elizabeth bore four children who would each follow dramatically different paths. Sophie, born first in 1855, lived only 2 years, but her death fundamentally altered Elizabeth's approach to motherhood. Gisella, born in 1856, survived to become a respected Bavarian princess and lived until 1932, bridging the imperial era with the modern age. Rudolph, the long-awaited male heir born in 1858, would carry the burden of succession until his mysterious death at Mayerling in 1889 shook the empire to its core. Finally, Valerie, born in 1868 and known as the Hungarian child, became Elizabeth's closest companion and the only child raised primarily under her mother's direct influence. Each child's story reflects different aspects of Habsburg family dynamics and the changing political landscape of 19th century Europe. On March 5, 1855, barely 8 months after her wedding, Empress Elisabeth gave birth to her first child at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. The daughter was named Sophie Friederike Dorothea Maria Josepha, after her paternal grandmother, Archduchess Sophie. The birth provided immediate relief to the court, which had anxiously awaited confirmation that the young empress could fulfill her primary dynastic duty. However, any hopes Elizabeth might have harbored about raising her own child were quickly dispelled. Following established Habsburg tradition, Archduchess Sophie immediately assumed complete control over the infant's care and upbringing. Elizabeth found herself relegated to formal visits at scheduled times, a restriction that deeply wounded the young mother and established a pattern of maternal displacement that would affect all her children. The naming of the child after the controlling grandmother symbolically reinforced who truly held authority over the imperial nursery. Young Sophie's daily life unfolded entirely within the rigid structure of the imperial court nursery, overseen by carefully selected staff loyal to Archduchess Sophie. The infant followed a strict schedule of feeding, sleeping, and limited exposure to fresh air, reflecting medical beliefs of the 1850s that emphasized controlled environments for aristocratic children. Elizabeth's attempts to spend time with her daughter were met with polite but firm resistance from her mother-in-law, who insisted that proper royal children required professional care rather than maternal sentiment. The baby was dressed in elaborate court clothing, even for routine activities, photographed for official portraits, and presented to visiting dignitaries as a symbol of Habsburg continuity. These early months established the precedent that imperial children belonged to the dynasty first and their parents second, a principle that would govern the upbringing of all Elizabeth's offspring until she finally asserted her authority with her youngest daughter. In May 1857, when Sophie was just over 2 years old, she accompanied her parents on an official journey to Hungary as part of Franz Joseph's efforts to strengthen ties with his Hungarian subjects. The trip represented one of the few extended periods when Elizabeth could spend substantial time with her daughter, away from Archduchess Sophie's direct supervision. However, during their stay in Budapest, the child suddenly developed severe symptoms, including high fever and diarrhea. The imperial physicians, working with limited medical understanding of childhood diseases, diagnosed what they believed to be dysentery, though modern medical analysis suggests the symptoms could have indicated several different conditions. The rapid progression of her illness alarmed the court physicians, who applied treatments typical of the era, including bloodletting and mercury-based medications. Elizabeth maintained a constant vigil at her daughter's bedside, experiencing for the first time the direct maternal responsibility that had been denied her during the child's normal upbringing. Archduchess Sophie died on May 29, 1857, in Budapest, just 24 days after her second birthday. The official cause of death was recorded as dysentery, though the exact medical circumstance remained unclear given the limited diagnostic capabilities of 19th century medicine. The loss devastated both parents, but it affected Elizabeth and Franz Joseph in distinctly different ways. The emperor, following court tradition, maintained public composure while privately grieving the loss of his firstborn. For Elizabeth, however, Sophie's death represented not only the loss of a child, but also the painful realization that she had been denied the opportunity to truly know her own daughter. The tragedy fundamentally altered Elizabeth's relationship with subsequent children, as she became determined never again to allow others to control her maternal relationships completely. The death also reinforced Elizabeth's growing alienation from court life and contributed to her eventual transformation from dutiful empress to restless wanderer, seeking meaning beyond the confines of Vienna's imperial protocols. On July 12, 1856, just 16 months after Sophie's birth, Elizabeth delivered her second daughter, Gisella Louise Marie. The rapid succession provided political reassurance that the empress remained fertile and capable of producing the male heir the dynasty desperately needed. Named after the medieval Hungarian queen Gisella, the daughter's name subtly acknowledged Franz Joseph's dual monarchy while maintaining Germanic royal traditions. Despite the recent arrival of her first grandchild, Archduchess Sophie once again assumed complete authority over the new baby's care and upbringing. Elizabeth, still recovering from Sophie's birth and struggling with the restrictive court protocols, found herself once more marginalized from her own child's daily life. The imperial household operated as if the children were state property rather than family members, with formal protocols governing even the most basic maternal interactions. This systematic separation from her children would become a source of lasting resentment for Elizabeth and a defining characteristic of Habsburg family life. Gisella's early years unfolded within the highly structured environment of the imperial nursery, where every aspect of her development followed protocols established by Archduchess Sophie. The child's day began at 6 a.m. with prayers, followed by breakfast, lessons, and carefully regulated periods of exercise and fresh air. Her education emphasized languages, music, drawing, and deportment, preparing her for her eventual role as a European princess available for dynastic marriage. Unlike modern royal children who might enjoy relatively informal family relationships, Gisella addressed her parents with formal titles and curtsied upon meeting them, even in private settings. The grandmother, who controlled her upbringing, instilled strict Catholic values and conservative political views, ensuring that the young Archduchess understood her place within the rigid hierarchy of Habsburg society. Despite the formal distance maintained between mother and daughter, Gisella developed into an intelligent and dutiful child who accepted court expectations without the rebellious tendencies that would later characterize her brother Rudolph. Sophie's death in 1857 cast a shadow over the imperial household and significantly altered Gisella's childhood experience. As the only surviving child for nearly a year, she became the sole focus of her grandmother's educational efforts and her parents' remaining hopes for family continuation. The tragedy made all the adults around her more protective and anxious, leading to even more restricted activities and supervised interactions. Elisabeth's grief over losing Sophie created a complex emotional distance from Gisella, as the Empress struggled with guilt over her limited relationship with her deceased daughter, while simultaneously feeling frustrated by her continued separation from her living child. The household's mourning customs meant that Gisella's early years were marked by more solemnity than typical for a young child, with reduced celebrations and entertainment. Nevertheless, she adapted to these circumstances with remarkable resilience, developing the practical and diplomatic skills that would later serve her well as a Bavarian princess navigating the complexities of German court life. As Gisella entered her teenage years during the 1860s, her education shifted toward preparation for her inevitable role as a European princess through marriage. Her curriculum expanded to include advanced studies in German, French, Italian, and Hungarian, reflecting the multinational character of potential Habsburg marriage alliances. She received extensive instruction in court etiquette for various European royal houses, learning the subtle differences in protocol that could make or break diplomatic relationships. Music and artistic accomplishments became central to her education, as these skills were considered essential for a princess who would need to charm foreign courts and represent Austrian interests abroad. Her religious education intensified under Jesuit supervision, ensuring her commitment to Catholic Orthodoxy that remained a cornerstone of Habsburg identity. Throughout this period, Elisabeth maintained her pattern of formal distance from her daughter, visiting according to schedule, but never developing the intimate maternal relationship that might have provided Gisella with emotional warmth to balance the rigid requirements of her imperial upbringing. On April 20th, 1873, 17-year-old Gisella married Prince Leopold of Bavaria in a magnificent ceremony at the Augustinerkirche in Vienna. The alliance represented a significant diplomatic achievement, strengthening ties between the Austrian and Bavarian royal houses at a time when German unification under Prussian leadership threatened traditional Habsburg influence in Central Europe. Leopold, 12 years older than his bride, had served with distinction in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 and offered Gisella the prospect of a respectable military husband with established credentials in Bavarian society. The wedding festivities lasted several days and included elaborate receptions, military parades, and cultural performances that showcased Habsburg power and Austrian-German cooperation. For Elisabeth, the marriage represented both pride in her daughter's successful dynastic placement and renewed separation, as Gisella would now live permanently in Munich rather than Vienna. The newlyweds departed for Bavaria amid great ceremony, beginning Gisella's transformation from Austrian archduchess to Bavarian princess and establishing her independence from the imperial court that had shaped her entire life until that moment. Gisella's arrival in Munich marked her entry into a royal court significantly different from the rigid protocols of Vienna. The Bavarian royal household maintained a more relaxed atmosphere with greater emphasis on cultural patronage and less obsession with ceremonial formality than characterized Habsburg court life. King Ludwig II's eccentric behavior and elaborate castle-building projects had created an environment where artistic expression and romantic idealism flourished alongside traditional royal duties. Gisella adapted successfully to these new circumstances, demonstrating the diplomatic skills and cultural sophistication that her Austrian education had provided. She established herself as a patron of Bavarian charities and cultural institutions, fulfilling the public role expected of a royal princess while building genuine relationships within Munich society. Her fluency in German dialects and understanding of regional customs helped her connect with ordinary Bavarians in ways that enhanced the royal family's local popularity. The contrast between her new environment and her Austrian upbringing allowed Gisella to develop aspects of her personality that had been suppressed by Viennese court conventions, leading to a more fulfilling personal life than she had experienced as an archduchess. Between 1874 and 1890, Gisella gave birth to 4 children who would carry Habsburg blood into the 20th century and beyond. Her eldest son, Georg, born in 1874, inherited his father's military interests and served with distinction during World War I before becoming a prominent figure in Bavarian society during the interwar period. Conrad, born in 1876, pursued artistic interests and became a patron of Munich's cultural institutions while maintaining the family's noble status through careful estate management. Her daughter Elizabeth, born in 1876, married into Austrian nobility, and maintained connections between the Bavarian and Austrian branches of her extended family throughout her long life. Rudolph, born in 1890 and named after his uncle, the Austrian crown prince, represented the continuation of Habsburg traditions within Bavarian royal circles. These children grew up with a more balanced upbringing than their mother had experienced, benefiting from Gisella's determination to avoid the emotional distance that had characterized her own childhood while maintaining appropriate royal standards and expectations for their futures in European aristocratic society. Throughout her years as a Bavarian princess, Gisella established herself as an active supporter of hospitals, orphanages, and educational institutions across Bavaria. Her charitable work reflected both genuine compassion and astute political awareness of the royal family's need to maintain public support during an era of increasing democratic sentiment. She became particularly involved with women's welfare organizations, supporting initiatives that provided job training and medical care for working-class mothers and their children. During the cholera epidemics that periodically swept through German cities, Gisella personally visited hospitals and contributed substantial funds for medical supplies and additional nursing staff. Her patronage of Bavarian cultural institutions included support for local museums, libraries, and musical societies that preserved regional traditions while promoting broader German cultural identity. These activities earned her genuine respect from ordinary Bavarians who appreciated her hands-on approach and willingness to appear at public events without excessive ceremony. Her charitable legacy continued through her children, who inherited both her sense of social responsibility and her understanding of the practical political benefits of royal visibility in community affairs. As Gisella entered her 50s during the early 1900s, she began gradually reducing her public commitments while maintaining her most important charitable patronages. The death of her father, Emperor Franz Joseph, in 1916 marked a significant transition in her life, as she lost her strongest remaining connection to the Habsburg imperial world of her childhood. World War I brought additional challenges as her sons served in the German army, while her Austrian relatives fought on opposing sides, creating complex emotional and political pressures within her family relationships. The collapse of both the German and Austrian monarchies in 1918 forced Gisella to adapt to a new political reality where royal titles carried historical significance but no actual political power. She handled these transitions with characteristic dignity, maintaining her household and charitable activities while avoiding political controversy that might have endangered her family's safety during the revolutionary upheavals that followed Germany's military defeat. Her final decades were marked by increasing focus on family relationships and private interests rather than public duties, reflecting both her advancing age and the changed circumstances of European royalty in the post-imperial era. Gisella died on July 27, 1932, at age 76, having lived long enough to witness the complete transformation of the European political order that had shaped her youth. Her funeral in Munich reflected both her Bavarian identity and her Habsburg heritage, with representatives from surviving noble families across Europe attending to honor her memory. She was buried beside her husband Leopold, who had predeceased her in 1930, in the Theatinerkirche, the traditional resting place of Bavarian royalty. Gisella's legacy extended far beyond her personal accomplishments, as her descendants continued to play important roles in European aristocratic society throughout the 20th century. Her branch of the Habsburg family tree maintained connections with both Austrian and German noble circles, preserving cultural traditions and family memories that might otherwise have been lost during the political upheavals that swept away the old monarchical system. Through her long life and numerous descendants, Gisella had successfully bridged the gap between the imperial past and the democratic future, demonstrating how European aristocracy could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining dignity and social usefulness. On August 21, 1858, after 3 years of marriage and the loss of one daughter, Elizabeth finally delivered the male heir that the Habsburg dynasty desperately needed. Rudolph Franz Karl Joseph was born at the Luxembourg Palace near Vienna amid celebrations that echoed across the empire and beyond. The birth secured the imperial succession and significantly elevated Elizabeth's status within the court hierarchy, as producing a male heir represented the ultimate fulfillment of an empress's dynastic duties. Church bells rang throughout Vienna, artillery salutes thundered from the city's fortifications, and congratulatory messages arrived from royal courts across Europe. Franz Joseph's relief was palpable as the continuation of the Habsburg line had been secured after considerable anxiety about the dynasty's future. For Elizabeth, Rudolph's birth represented both triumph and renewed conflict with Archduchess Sophie, who once again assumed complete control over the infant's care and upbringing. The Crown Prince's arrival fundamentally altered the family dynamics, as he would carry expectations and pressures that his sisters could never experience as female members of the imperial household. Rudolph's education began almost immediately under the strict supervision of military officers selected by Archduchess Sophie and approved by Franz Joseph. The curriculum emphasized physical discipline, military history, and absolute obedience to imperial authority, reflecting the belief that future emperors needed iron resolve to govern effectively. Colonel Leopold Gondrecourt, appointed as the child's primary tutor, implemented a harsh regimen that included cold baths, military drills, and severe punishments for any display of weakness or emotional sensitivity. Elizabeth protested these methods repeatedly, but found herself overruled by both her husband and mother-in-law, who insisted that imperial heirs required exceptional preparation for their future responsibilities. The young prince showed early signs of intellectual curiosity and sensitivity that clashed with his rigid military training, creating internal conflicts that would persist throughout his life. Unlike his sisters, who could expect to marry into foreign courts and leave Vienna, Rudolph faced the certainty of remaining forever bound to Austrian imperial duties and expectations that he was already beginning to question. Despite his military upbringing, Rudolph developed remarkable intellectual abilities and broad cultural interests that set him apart from typical Habsburg princes. He became fluent in German, Hungarian, Czech, French, and English, demonstrating a linguistic facility that reflected both natural talent and intensive instruction from court tutors. His scientific curiosities extended to ornithology, botany, and geography, leading to serious academic pursuits that included published research on Austrian wildlife and natural resources. Rudolph's writings revealed sophisticated analytical thinking and liberal political sympathies that increasingly concerned conservative court officials who preferred princes focused on traditional military and ceremonial duties. He corresponded with leading European intellectuals and scientists, developing perspectives that often conflicted with official Habsburg policies on nationalism and constitutional reform. These intellectual pursuits provided Rudolph with an identity beyond his role as crown prince, but they also highlighted the growing gap between his personal convictions and the political realities he would inherit as emperor. His scientific expeditions and scholarly publications earned him respect among European intellectual circles while simultaneously raising questions about his commitment to traditional imperial values. As Rudolph reached maturity during the 1870s, his official duties expanded to include military service, diplomatic missions, and participation in imperial government councils. He received commissions in various Habsburg military units and traveled extensively throughout the empire, gaining first-hand knowledge of the diverse nationalities and regional challenges that would define his future reign. His political training included attendance at ministerial meetings, diplomatic receptions, and ceremonial functions that introduced him to the complex machinery of imperial administration. Rudolph demonstrated competence in these formal roles while privately expressing frustration with the slow pace of political reform and the monarchy's resistance to constitutional changes demanded by various national groups. His travels to Hungary, Bohemia, and other imperial provinces exposed him to nationalist movements that challenged traditional Habsburg authority and convinced him that significant political reforms would be necessary to preserve the empire's future stability. These experiences created tension between his growing understanding of practical political necessities and the conservative philosophy that dominated his father's government and court advisors. Rudolph's political philosophy evolved throughout the 1880s toward liberal constitutionalism and multinational federalism that directly contradicted his father's centralizing tendencies and conservative instincts. He advocated for greater autonomy for Hungary, constitutional rights for Slavic nationalities, and democratic reforms that would modernize the Habsburg system without destroying its essential unity. His written works and private correspondence revealed sympathy for oppressed minorities and criticism of aristocratic privilege, that alarmed traditional supporters of absolute imperial authority. Franz Joseph viewed his son's political ideas as dangerous departures from proven Habsburg methods, and refused to grant Rudolph significant independent authority in government affairs. The Crown Prince's frustration with his limited influence led to increasingly bitter private confrontations with his father, who insisted that imperial heirs should support existing policies rather than advocate for fundamental changes. These political disagreements reflected broader generational conflicts within European royalty, as younger princes educated in liberal ideas clashed with older monarchs committed to traditional autocratic methods. Rudolph's isolation within his own government contributed to his growing sense of personal futility and political powerlessness that would characterize his final years. On May 10, 1881, 23-year-old Rudolph married 16-year-old Princess Stephanie of Belgium in a grand ceremony at the Augustinerkirche in Vienna. The marriage represented a significant diplomatic alliance between the Habsburg and Belgian royal houses, while providing Rudolph with a wife from an established Catholic royal family. Stephanie, daughter of King Leopold II, brought both royal pedigree and substantial financial resources to the union, fulfilling traditional requirements for crown princess marriages. The wedding celebrations extended for several days and included elaborate receptions, military parades, and cultural performances that showcased Habsburg power and Austrian imperial magnificence to European observers. Initial public reception of the marriage was enthusiastic, as Stephanie's youth and beauty complemented Rudolph's intellectual reputation and military bearing. However, the couple's fundamental incompatibility became apparent soon after their wedding, as Rudolph's liberal political views and scientific interests clashed with Stephanie's conventional royal expectations and limited intellectual curiosity. The marriage that had promised dynastic stability and personal happiness for the crown prince instead became another source of disappointment and isolation in his increasingly troubled life. On September 2, 1883, Crown Princess Stephanie gave birth to the couple's only child, Archduchess Elisabeth Marie, nicknamed Erzy within the imperial family. The daughter's birth provided temporary hope for the continuation of the Habsburg direct line while reinforcing the dynasty's stability after several years of political and economic challenges. Rudolph showed genuine affection for his daughter and took active interest in her early development, demonstrating parenting instincts that contrasted sharply with his own distant upbringing under military tutors. However, the birth also highlighted the growing problems in Rudolph and Stephanie's marriage, as medical complications prevented the crown princess from having additional children who might have secured the imperial succession more completely. The lack of a male heir meant that Rudolph remained the only direct successor to Franz Joseph, intensifying pressure on the crown prince to maintain his health and avoid the risky behaviors that were becoming increasingly evident to court observers. Elizabeth Marie's existence provided Rudolph with genuine emotional satisfaction, but also reminded him daily of his dynastic responsibilities and the limited time he had to resolve the political and personal conflicts that were consuming his adult life. By the mid-1880s, Rudolph and Stephanie's marriage had deteriorated into a formal arrangement maintained for public appearances rather than genuine partnership. Their fundamental incompatibility extended beyond political differences to include completely different approaches to social life, intellectual pursuits, and personal relationships within Vienna's complex court society. Rudolph's liberal political activities and scientific interests left little time for the ceremonial duties and social obligations that Stephanie considered central to royal life, creating resentment on both sides of their relationship. The crown princess's conventional religious views and conservative social attitudes clashed repeatedly with Rudolph's increasingly radical criticism of church influence and aristocratic privilege in Austrian society. Their separate living arrangements within the Hofburg Palace became an open secret among Vienna's aristocratic circles, contributing to gossip and speculation about the crown prince's personal life and political reliability. The couple's public appearances together became increasingly strained and formal, reflecting their private estrangement and adding to Rudolph's sense of isolation within his own family and court environment. In late 1888, Rudolph began an intimate relationship with 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera, daughter of a wealthy banking family with connections to Vienna's cosmopolitan society. Mary represented a complete contrast to Rudolph's estranged wife, offering intellectual curiosity, emotional warmth, and genuine admiration for the Crown Prince's political ideals and scientific accomplishments. Their relationship developed quickly during the winter social season of 1888 to 1889, conducted with discretion but insufficient secrecy to avoid detection by court officials and foreign diplomats monitoring Habsburg family affairs. Mary's letters to Rudolph, discovered after their deaths, revealed deep emotional attachment and shared political sympathies that provided the Crown Prince with personal satisfaction that had been missing from his marriage and official duties. The relationship created additional strain within Rudolph's family as Franz Joseph and Elizabeth became aware of their son's involvement with a woman whose social status made marriage impossible and whose presence threatened further scandal for the imperial household. Contemporary evidence suggests that Rudolph viewed his relationship with Mary as both genuine emotional refuge and potential escape from the dynastic obligations that had come to dominate and frustrate his adult life. On January 30th, 1889, Rudolph and Mary Vetsera were found dead at the Imperial Hunting Lodge of Mayerling, approximately 30 miles southwest of Vienna. The initial discovery was made by Crown Prince Rudolph's valet, who had been unable to rouse his master for a scheduled hunting expedition and eventually forced entry into the locked bedroom where both bodies were discovered. Official investigation concluded that Rudolph had shot Mary before taking his own life with his service revolver, though the exact sequence of events and motivations remain subjects of historical debate due to limited contemporary documentation and conflicting witness testimonies. The imperial court immediately imposed strict censorship on news coverage and controlled the release of information to minimize scandal and preserve Habsburg prestige during the crisis that followed the Crown Prince's death. Franz Joseph ordered the destruction of most personal documents found at Mayerling, including letters and other materials that might have explained Rudolph's final actions or revealed sensitive political information that could have endangered the monarchy's stability. The official cause of death was announced as heart failure, though this deception was quickly abandoned as the true circumstances became impossible to conceal from European diplomatic circles and international press coverage. Rudolph's death immediately shifted the imperial succession to Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Franz Joseph's nephew, fundamentally altering the Habsburg dynasty's future and European political calculations. The tragedy devastated both Elizabeth and Franz Joseph, though they responded to their grief in characteristically different ways that reflected their contrasting personalities and coping mechanisms. Elizabeth withdrew further from court life and increased her restless travels across Europe, seeking solace in constant movement and avoidance of painful reminders of her lost son. Franz Joseph maintained his public duties with stoic determination while privately struggling with guilt over his conflicts with Rudolph and regret about their inability to reconcile their political differences before the Crown Prince's death. The succession change required extensive diplomatic negotiations to ensure Franz Ferdinand's acceptance by European powers and Hungarian political leaders who had expected Rudolph's eventual reign and needed reassurance about continuity in Habsburg policies. Rudolph's death also eliminated the possibility of liberal political reforms that the Crown Prince had advocated, ensuring that the empire would continue under conservative leadership that proved inadequate to address the nationalist challenges that ultimately destroyed the Habsburg monarchy in 1918. The Mayerling incident became a symbol of imperial decline and romantic tragedy that captured European imagination while marking the beginning of the final chapter in Habsburg imperial history. On April 22, 1868, 10 years after Rudolph's birth, Elizabeth delivered her fourth and final child, Marie Valerie Mathilde Amélie, at the royal palace in Buda. The timing and location of the birth held deep political significance, as it occurred shortly after the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 that had established the dual monarchy and granted significant autonomy to Hungarian territories. Elizabeth deliberately chose to give birth in Hungary rather than Vienna, symbolically emphasizing her personal commitment to Hungarian interests and her role as Queen of Hungary alongside her imperial Austrian title. The infant was immediately nicknamed the Hungarian Child by both court circles and Hungarian nationalist politicians who viewed her birth as evidence of Elizabeth's genuine affection for their nation and culture. Unlike her previous children, Marie Valerie's arrival occurred during a period when Elizabeth had gained sufficient confidence and authority to assert her maternal rights against the traditional Habsburg system of court-controlled child-rearing. The birth represented both personal fulfillment for Elizabeth and political statement about the changing nature of the dual monarchy that would define the remainder of the 19th century. For the first time in her maternal experience, Elizabeth successfully insisted on maintaining direct control over her daughter's daily care and education, breaking the pattern that had governed the upbringing of Sophie, Gisella, and Rudolph. She established Marie Valerie's primary residence at Gödöllő Palace, the Hungarian royal estate that had become Elizabeth's preferred home and symbol of her identification with Hungarian culture and political autonomy. The child's early years were spent learning Hungarian as her first language, followed by German and French, reflecting Elizabeth's determination to raise a daughter who would embody the multinational character of the Habsburg realms. Unlike the rigid military discipline imposed on Rudolph or the formal court protocols that had shaped Gisella's education, Marie Valerie experienced a more relaxed and affectionate upbringing that emphasized cultural appreciation, linguistic skills, and personal relationships over dynastic obligations. Elizabeth's direct involvement in her youngest daughter's development created an unusually close mother-daughter bond that would persist throughout both their lives and provide emotional satisfaction that had been denied to the Empress in her relationships with her other children. Marie Valerie's education reflected Elizabeth's own interests and values rather than traditional Habsburg curriculum requirements imposed by court officials. Her studies included extensive reading in Hungarian literature and history, music lessons that emphasized both classical European and traditional Hungarian folk traditions, and outdoor activities that developed physical stamina and appreciation for natural beauty. Elizabeth frequently took her daughter on extended travels throughout the Hungarian provinces, exposing her to regional customs, local dialects, and rural life that most imperial family members never experienced directly. These journeys strengthened Marie Valerie's Hungarian identity while providing Elizabeth with opportunities to fulfill her queenly duties in ways that aligned with her personal convictions and political sympathies. The close relationship between mother and daughter became a source of controversy within the imperial court, where traditionalists worried that Elizabeth's influence would undermine Marie Valerie's loyalty to Austrian imperial interests and Catholic Orthodox teachings. Nevertheless, Elizabeth persisted in her unconventional approach to child-rearing, determined to provide at least one of her children with the maternal affection and cultural education that she believed essential for personal happiness and political understanding. As Marie Valerie reached adolescence during the early 1880s, she began appearing at official court functions and state ceremonies that introduced her to Vienna's aristocratic society and European diplomatic circles. Her fluency in multiple languages and deep knowledge of Hungarian culture made her an effective representative of the dual monarchy's multinational character during public appearances and formal receptions. Unlike her siblings, who had been trained primarily for dynastic marriages and ceremonial roles, Marie Valerie demonstrated genuine interest in charitable work and social issues that reflected both her mother's influence and her own developing personality. Her public appearances were generally well received as she combined royal dignity with approachable warmth that appealed to both aristocratic observers and ordinary subjects who encountered her during official visits to Hungarian provinces. However, her close identification with Hungarian interests occasionally created diplomatic complications when her presence or statements were interpreted as imperial endorsement of Hungarian political positions that conflicted with Austrian governmental policies. These early experiences in public life prepared Marie Valerie for her eventual role as a bridge between different cultural and political communities within the Habsburg realms. In July 1890, 22-year-old Marie Valerie married Archduke Franz Salvator of Austria-Tuscany in a ceremony that reflected both her royal status and her family's somewhat unconventional approach to dynastic marriages. Franz Salvator, a member of a cadet branch of the Habsburg family, offered the advantage of maintaining Marie Valerie's Austrian noble status while allowing her to choose a husband based on personal affection rather than purely political considerations. The marriage required Franz Salvator to renounce his rights to the succession of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, demonstrating the couple's willingness to prioritize personal happiness over maximum dynastic advantage. Elizabeth strongly supported the match, viewing it as validation of her belief that royal children should have some voice in their marriage choices rather than accepting purely arranged alliances dictated by political necessity. The wedding celebration took place at Ischl, a resort town associated with Elizabeth's happiest family memories, rather than in the formal setting of Vienna's imperial churches, where traditional Habsburg marriages occurred. This choice of venue symbolized Marie Valerie's somewhat independent position within the imperial family and her mother's continuing influence over her personal decisions, even after reaching marriageable age. Between 1891 and 1909, Marie Valerie gave birth to 10 children who would carry Habsburg blood well into the 20th century while maintaining connections to both Austrian and Hungarian cultural traditions. Her eldest son, Franz Karl, born in 1891, inherited his parents' intellectual interests and became a scholar of Austrian history and genealogy. Hubert, born in 1892, pursued military service and later became involved in post-imperial Austrian political movements that sought to preserve monarchist traditions in democratic contexts. Her daughters Elizabeth, born in 1893, and Hedwig, born in 1896, married into European noble families and maintained international connections that preserved Habsburg influence despite the monarchy's eventual collapse. The younger children, including Theodore, Gertrude, Georg, Clemens, Agnes, and Maria, grew up during the final decades of imperial rule and adapted to dramatically changed political circumstances after 1918. Marie Valerie approached motherhood with the same hands-on involvement that Elizabeth had provided during her own upbringing, ensuring that all her children learned multiple languages, understood their complex cultural heritage, and developed the practical skills necessary for survival in an uncertain political future. Her large family represented both the continuation of Habsburg genetic lines and the adaptation of imperial traditions to more democratic and egalitarian social conditions that characterized early 20th century Europe. Following her marriage, Marie Valerie established her primary residence at Walsee Castle in Lower Austria, where she created a household that combined aristocratic traditions with more modern approaches to rural estate management and community relations. The castle became a center for charitable activities that included support for local schools, medical facilities, and economic development projects that improved living conditions for ordinary Austrian families in the surrounding region. Marie Valerie's charitable work reflected both genuine compassion and practical understanding that aristocratic survival in democratic times required demonstrable social usefulness and public service, rather than mere ceremonial presence. She became particularly involved with women's welfare organizations that provided job training, medical care, and educational opportunities for working-class mothers and their children throughout Lower Austria. Her religious activities centered on Catholic charitable institutions while maintaining tolerance for other Christian denominations and avoiding the religious controversies that sometimes divided Austrian society along confessional lines. The estate at Walsee also served as a gathering place for former imperial officials and aristocratic families who sought to preserve cultural traditions and personal relationships that had defined Habsburg society before the monarchy's collapse in 1918. Following Elizabeth's assassination in Geneva in September 1898, Marie Valerie became her grandfather's primary emotional support and most frequent family visitor during the final 18 years of Franz Joseph's reign. She regularly traveled from Walsee to Vienna and other imperial residences, providing the elderly emperor with companionship and family connection that helped alleviate his increasing isolation after losing his wife, son, and brother within a relatively short period. Their correspondence reveals genuine mutual affection and shared concern for Habsburg family traditions and Austrian imperial interests during an era of increasing political challenges and international tensions. Marie Valerie's role as emotional confidant did not extend to political influence, as Franz Joseph maintained his traditional separation between family relationships and governmental decision-making throughout his long reign. However, her presence provided psychological comfort and personal stability that enabled the aging emperor to continue functioning effectively in his official duties despite private grief and family tragedies that might have overwhelmed less determined individuals. Her loyalty and devotion during these difficult years earned her special recognition within Habsburg family circles and reinforced her position as the most successful of Elizabeth's children in terms of personal happiness and family relationships. During World War I, Marie Valerie's charitable activities expanded to include support for military hospitals, refugee assistance programs, and welfare organizations that addressed the massive humanitarian crisis created by 4 years of total war. Her sons served in Austrian military units while her daughters participated in nursing and relief work that brought the family into direct contact with the suffering and destruction that characterized the conflict's impact on civilian populations. The collapse of the Habsburg monarchy in 1918 required Marie Valerie to adapt her charitable and social activities to Republican political conditions while maintaining dignity and avoiding controversy that might have endangered her family's safety or property. She successfully navigated the transition from imperial to democratic Austria by emphasizing her charitable work and local community connections rather than political opposition to the new Republican government. Her estate management at Walsee demonstrated practical skills that enabled her family to maintain financial stability and social position despite losing imperial subsidies and facing increased taxation under democratic rule. The post-imperial years also allowed Marie Valerie to develop closer relationships with her adult children, who appreciated both their mother's guidance and her successful adaptation to dramatically changed political circumstances. Marie Valerie died on September 6, 1924, at age 56, having lived long enough to see the complete transformation of the Central European political order that had defined her early life. Her funeral at Walsee reflected both her Austrian noble status and her role as a beloved local figure who had contributed significantly to regional charitable and cultural institutions. She was buried in the family vault at Walsee Castle, surrounded by the community where she had spent her most productive and satisfying years as wife, mother, and local benefactor. Her extensive diaries and correspondence, preserved by her descendants, provide valuable historical insights into Habsburg family life, imperial court society, and the personal experiences of European aristocracy during the transition from monarchy to democracy. Marie Valerie's children and grandchildren continued to play important roles in Austrian and international aristocratic circles throughout the 20th century, maintaining cultural traditions and family connections that preserved Habsburg heritage, despite political changes that eliminated their ancestors' political power. Her legacy represented the successful adaptation of imperial aristocratic values to democratic social conditions, demonstrating how European noble families could maintain dignity and social usefulness without political authority or governmental influence. The contrasting fates of Elizabeth's 4 children perfectly encapsulate the trajectory of the Habsburg Empire from mid-19th century confidence to early 20th century collapse and transformation. Sophie's brief life and early death in 1857 symbolized the fragility of dynastic hopes and the personal tragedies that would repeatedly strike the imperial family throughout the remainder of the century. Gisella's long survival until 1932 represented the adaptability and resilience that enabled some members of European royalty to maintain dignity and social position despite losing political power and governmental authority. Rudolph's tragic end at Mayerling embodied the political tensions and generational conflicts that ultimately destroyed traditional monarchical systems across Central and Eastern Europe. Marie Valerie's successful transition to post-imperial life demonstrated how aristocratic families could preserve cultural values and social usefulness while adapting to democratic political conditions and modern social expectations. Together, their stories illustrate both the human cost of political upheaval and the remarkable capacity for personal adaptation that characterized European aristocracy during one of history's most transformative periods. The descendants of Elizabeth's surviving children continue to connect modern European aristocratic families with the imperial Habsburg heritage that shaped Central European history for over 6 centuries. Gisella's Bavarian line produced numerous princes and princesses who married into German, Austrian, and international noble families throughout the 20th century, preserving Habsburg genetic and cultural connections across multiple generations. Marie Valerie's 10 children established the most extensive modern Habsburg descendant network, with family members scattered across Europe and beyond, maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to contemporary social and economic conditions. Rudolph's daughter, Elizabeth Marie, despite her father's tragic end, lived until 1963 and connected the Crown Prince's legacy with post-World War II European society through her own descendants and charitable activities. These modern Habsburg descendants represent living links to an imperial past that continues to fascinate historians and genealogists interested in European royal connections, and the persistence of aristocratic family traditions despite revolutionary political changes. Their survival and continued prominence demonstrate the enduring appeal of Habsburg heritage and the successful adaptation of imperial bloodlines to democratic and egalitarian social conditions that would have been unimaginable to Empress Elizabeth during her own turbulent lifetime. Through 4 dramatically different life stories, the children of Empress Elizabeth illustrate both the personal costs of imperial privilege and the remarkable human capacity for adaptation in the face of historical transformation. From Sophie's early death to Marie Valerie's successful integration into modern Austrian society, their experiences provide unique insights into the decline of traditional monarchy and the emergence of contemporary European civilization. Their collective legacy continues through hundreds of descendants who carry Habsburg blood while living ordinary lives as citizens of democratic nations that their imperial ancestors once ruled as absolute monarchs.